I took care of my mother for 11 years. Then I read her real will. For 11 years, my mother's house smelled like lavender lotion, and the particular staleness of a room that rarely got fresh air. I knew that smell the way other people know the smell of their childhood kitchen. I knew it because I lived inside it. Every morning at 6:15, before my own daughter woke up, before my husband left for work, I drove the 14 minutes from my house to my mother's house, let myself in with the key I'd had cut a decade earlier, and started the coffee she could no longer make for herself. My name is Sarah, and for 11 years I was the only child who showed up. I want to tell you this story slowly because that is how it happened to me. Nothing about it was sudden except the very end, and even the ending, when I look back now, had been building quietly for a long time. I just didn't know how to read the signs while I was living inside them. You never do, I think, when you're the one doing the loving and the driving and the medication charts and the middle of the night phone calls. You're too tired to suspect anyone of anything. You're just trying to get through the day. My mother, Margaret, had her first stroke when I was 31. My daughter, Lily, was 2 years old at the time. I remember standing in the hospital hallway with her on my hip, my phone pressed to my ear, trying to explain to my older brother David what the doctor had said about weakness on her left side, about the word she couldn't quite reach anymore, about rehabilitation and home care and the long road ahead. David listened for maybe 90 seconds before he said he had a client call in 5 minutes and could I just keep him posted. My younger sister, Denise, didn't answer at all. She called back 2 days later, cried for a while on the phone, told me how devastated she was, and then didn't visit for another 6 weeks. I don't say this to make either of them into cartoon villains. That's not what this story is. David ran a growing insurance brokerage 2 states away, and had a wife and 2 teenagers who needed him. Denise had her own complicated life, a marriage that was falling apart quietly behind closed doors, a job that didn't offer much flexibility. I understood, or told myself I understood, why the weight naturally settled onto me. I lived 12 minutes from our mother. I had, in David's words once, spoken almost proudly, more bandwidth. I didn't correct him. I didn't say that bandwidth is not something you have, it's something you sacrifice. So I sacrificed it. For 11 years. I learned how to change a catheter bag without flinching. I learned the exact rhythm of my mother's physical therapy exercises, so I could do them with her on the days the therapist didn't come. I learned to recognize the difference between her being tired and her being in pain, a distinction that took months to master and that no one else in my family ever bothered to learn at all. I gave up my part-time bookkeeping job in the 4th year, when her needs increased and my husband, Mark, and I decided the income wasn't worth what it was costing our family in stress. We told ourselves it was temporary. It became permanent. Mark never once complained about it, not really, though I know now there were nights he sat in our garage alone, doing his own kind of quiet math about what all of this was costing us. My mother, in her better years, in the years before her mind started slipping too, used to hold my hand and tell me she didn't know what she would do without me. She said it so many times it became a kind of ritual between us, something she'd say while I was combing the tangles out of her thinning hair or helping her into a cardigan. I don't know what I'd do without you, Sarah. And I believed her. I believed that meant something. I believed, somewhere in the unspoken architecture of our relationship, that this mattered, that it was being seen, that it was being remembered. There were good years mixed in with the hard ones, and I think it's important to say that too, because this isn't a story about 11 years of unbroken misery. There were afternoons when my mother's mind was clear and sharp, when we'd sit on her back porch with mugs of tea going cold in our hands while she told me stories about my father, about the apartment they'd rented in their 20s with a radiator that clanked all night, about the year they almost moved to another state for a job that fell through at the last minute. I learned things about her in those years that I never would have learned if she'd stayed healthy and independent and busy with her own life the way she'd been before the stroke. There is an intimacy in caregiving that no one warns you about, a closeness that forms in the small, unglamorous moments, helping someone put in their earrings, learning which television programs actually held her attention, and which ones she only pretended to watch to be polite. But there were also the harder years, the ones that came later, when her memory began to slip in a different way than the stroke had damaged her speech, a slower fog that crept in around the edges of her mind. I learned to recognize the mornings when she wouldn't quite know what year it was, and I learned not to correct her too harshly, to let her live for a few minutes in whatever year felt safe to her before gently steering her back. I learned to sit with her at 2 in the morning when she woke up frightened and disoriented, calling out for my father, who had been gone for over a decade by then. I never once told David or Denise about those nights in detail, because I didn't want their sympathy, I wanted their presence, and somewhere along the way I stopped believing the two were the same thing. She died on a Tuesday in October quietly in her sleep, in the bed I had helped her into the night before, with the humidifier running the way she liked it and a photo of my father on the nightstand angle just so, the way she always kept it. I was the one who found her. I was the one who called the funeral home. I was the one who picked out the dress she was buried in, because I was the only one who still knew which one was her favorite. David flew in for the funeral. Denise drove up from 3 hours away. Both of them cried, and I believe the tears were real, because grief doesn't require attendance records to be genuine. But I noticed something in the days after the funeral, something small, something I filed away without fully understanding why it bothered me. David kept asking in a tone he probably thought was casual, when we were going to handle things. Denise kept mentioning, almost in passing, how much the house must be worth now, given how the neighborhood had changed. I didn't think much of it. Grief does strange things to people. Some people cry, some people get busy, some people start talking about logistics because logistics feel safer than feelings. I told myself that's all it was. The will reading was scheduled for 11 days after the funeral, at the office of a lawyer named Alan Pierce, a man who had known our family for almost 30 years. He had been my father's attorney before he became my mother's, a soft-spoken man in his 60s with reading glasses that lived on a chain around his neck and a habit of clearing his throat before he said anything he thought might be difficult to hear. I remember sitting in his office in one of 3 chairs arranged in front of his desk, with David on my left in a suit that looked too expensive for a Tuesday morning and Denise on my right, twisting a tissue in her hands even though she wasn't crying. I remember the particular quality of the light coming through the blinds, striping the carpet in pale gold bars. I remember thinking with a kind of naive comfort that whatever the will said, it would reflect what my mother and I both knew to be true, that I had been there, that I had given up years of my life, that love in the end tends to be recognized. I was wrong about that, or at least I was about to be told I was wrong. Mr. Pierce cleared his throat, the way he did, and began to read. The house, the one I had spent 11 years cleaning and cooking in and sitting beside my mother's bed inside, was to be split 3 ways, equally, between David, Denise, and me. The modest investment portfolio my father had left behind, also split 3 ways. A small collection of jewelry, distributed with specific pieces named for Denise, nothing named for me. And then, almost as an afterthought, a paragraph acknowledging my care and attention during my mother's final years, followed by a bequest of $5,000, described as a token of appreciation. $5,000. After 11 years. I sat very still. I remember that stillness more than I remember anything else about that moment, a kind of internal silence that fell over me like snow muffling everything. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was confused in a way that felt almost physical, like the room had tilted 2 degrees and nothing quite lined up anymore. David didn't say anything. He nodded slightly, the way you nod when a business deal closes about the way you expected. Denise reached over and squeezed my hand, murmured something about how Mom always meant to update things. And I remember thinking even then that it was an odd thing to say. Meant to. As if she knew something about intention that hadn't made it into this room. I didn't make a scene. That's not who I am, and it's not, I think, who my mother raised me to be. I thanked Mr. Pierce. I signed what needed to be signed for the moment, and I drove home in a silence so total that Mark, waiting for me on the porch, knew something was wrong before I even got out of the car. That night, after Lily was asleep, I sat at our kitchen table with a glass of wine I didn't drink and I told Mark everything the will had said. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about him, and when I was finished he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he asked a question that changed the entire shape of what came next. Does that sound like your mother to you? I hadn't thought to ask myself that question yet. I had been too busy absorbing the hurt to interrogate the shape of it. But once Mark asked, I couldn't stop asking it myself. Because no, it didn't sound like her. Not the mother who held my hand and told me she didn't know what she'd do without me. Not the mother who, in one of her clearer months about 4 years before she died, had sat across from me at her kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and said, with a clarity that had startled me at the time, I want to make sure you're taken care of, Sarah. After everything. I don't want you to worry about this house. I remembered that conversation so specifically because it had been unusual. My mother rarely spoke about money, rarely spoke about the future in concrete terms. But that day she had been focused, almost businesslike, and she'd mentioned calling Mr. Pierce's office to update some things. I remembered it because I had felt relieved, and a little embarrassed to feel relieved, as though caring about the money made the caregiving less pure somehow. I had pushed the memory away in the years since, told myself it didn't matter, that I wasn't doing any of this for a reward. But now, sitting at my kitchen table with cold wine and a $5,000 token of appreciation, I let myself remember it fully. And I let myself wonder for the first time whether that conversation had ever gone anywhere. Whether there was another version of the story sitting in a drawer somewhere, waiting to be found. Or whether someone had made sure it never got the chance. I didn't say any of this to David or Denise. Not yet. I didn't have anything to say it with. Suspicion isn't evidence, and I had been raised in a strange way by the very woman I was now doubting, to never accuse without proof. So instead, over the following weeks, while I helped clear out my mother's house, room by room, closet by closet, I started paying attention in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. The first thing I noticed was small. In my mother's bedroom closet, on the top shelf behind a stack of old photo albums, there was a fireproof lockbox, gray, dented at one corner, the kind you buy at an office supply store for $40. I had seen it before years earlier but had never had reason to open it. My mother had always called it her important papers, and I had respected that the way you respect a closed door in someone else's house. The lockbox was locked and I didn't have a key. I searched her nightstand, her jewelry box, the little ceramic dish by the front door where she kept spare keys for everything from the garden shed to the old car she'd stopped driving years before I started caring for her full time. Nothing fit. I set the box aside, told myself I'd deal with it later, and kept working through the house. The second thing I noticed came about 10 days later, when I was going through a filing cabinet in what used to be my father's home office, untouched by anyone but me for the better part of a decade. Tucked into a folder labeled simply Bank, behind a stack of old statements, I found a business card. Not Alan Pierce's card. A different lawyer's, a name I didn't recognize, from a small firm 2 towns over. On the back, in my mother's careful, looping handwriting, the same handwriting I'd watched deteriorate and then partially recover after her stroke, was written a date and a time. A date roughly 4 years earlier. Around the same time as that conversation at her kitchen table. I sat on the floor of my father's old office for a long time, holding that card, feeling something shift inside my chest that I didn't yet have words for. The third thing happened almost by accident, the way the most important things in this story tended to. I was going through my mother's address book, an old-fashioned paper one, trying to compile a list of people to notify about the estate, when I recognized a name written in the margin, added later, in pen that looked newer than the rest of the entries. It was the name of Carol Jenkins, my mother's home hospice nurse during her final 18 months, a kind, sharp-eyed woman who used to bring my mother lemon drops and talk to her about old movies. I hadn't spoken to Carol since the funeral. I decided to call her. Carol answered on the third ring, and when I explained who I was, her voice warmed immediately, the way it always had. We talked for a few minutes about my mother, about how much she'd enjoyed Carol's visits, and then gently, I asked if Carol remembered anything unusual from those months. Anything about paperwork or visitors, or anything my mother might have mentioned about her will. There was a pause on the line. A long one. I probably shouldn't say too much, Carol said finally. But I do remember something. About a year before she passed, your mother asked me to be a witness for a document she was signing. A notary came to the house. I remember because it was unusual, and because your brother was there that day, which was rare. My hands went cold around the phone. Do you remember what the document was? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't read it, Carol said. It wasn't my place to. But I remember your mother seemed very clear that day, very focused, more like herself than she'd been in a while. She thanked me afterward. She said something like, "Now it's done right." I remember that phrase because it stuck with me. Now it's done right. Now it's done right. I thanked Carol, hung up the phone, and sat in silence for what felt like a very long time. Because if my mother had signed a new document, witnessed by a notary with David present, then somewhere, there was a will that was not the will Mr. Pierce had read in his office. And if that will existed and had never surfaced, then someone had made a choice about which version of my mother's wishes the world would see. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment because I think it's important, and because I think it's different from what these stories usually claim their narrators felt. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated, not yet. I felt sick. I felt a specific, quiet grief that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the possibility that my brother had looked at our mother, at her clarity, at her wishes, and had decided they were inconvenient. I called Mark before I called anyone else. He came home early from work that day, sat with me at the kitchen table, and helped me think it through calmly, the way he always does when I'm too close to something to see it straight. We agreed on one thing immediately. I wasn't going to confront David based on a hunch and a phone call. I needed proof. Real proof. Something that couldn't be argued away or explained as a misunderstanding. So I kept looking. The lockbox became my obsession for the next several weeks. I tried and failed to find a key anywhere in the house. Eventually, on Mark's suggestion, I brought it to a locksmith who specialized in older security boxes, a small shop downtown with a bell over the door, and a man named Frank who didn't ask questions, just charged me $60 and pried the lock with a tool I didn't recognize. Inside, wrapped in a plastic sleeve to protect it from the damp, was a stack of documents that would end up changing everything. There was a copy of a will, dated roughly a year and a half before my mother's death, notarized with 2 witness signatures. One of them was Carol Jenkins. The other was a name I didn't recognize, presumably the notary herself. This will named me as the primary beneficiary of the house, citing in careful legal language, my sustained and exclusive care of my mother over the preceding years. It left the investment portfolio split more generously in my favor as well, with smaller allocations to David and Denise. It was, in every sense, the document that reflected the conversation my mother had had with me at her kitchen table years earlier. Now it's done right. Beneath the will there was something else. A handwritten letter addressed to me in my mother's handwriting, dated the same day as the will. I remember my hands were shaking so badly, I had to set it down on the kitchen table and take a breath before I could read it. In the letter, my mother explained in her own words why she had made the changes. She wrote about watching me give up my job, my time, my own small comforts, year after year without complaint. She wrote about noticing, painfully, how rarely David and Denise called, how their visits had become performances rather than presents. She wrote that she loved all 3 of her children, that this wasn't about love but about fairness, about wanting the person who had carried the weight to not also carry an insult on top of it. And then she wrote something that I have never been able to read without crying, not once in all the times I've read it since. She wrote that she was worried David would try to talk her out of it, or worse, try to undo it after she was gone, and that if I was ever reading this letter without the will attached to her file, it meant something had gone wrong, and that I should not be afraid to find out what. She had known. On some level she had known. I also found, folded beneath the letter, a printed email exchange between my mother and the second lawyer, the one whose card I'd found in my father's old filing cabinet. In the emails, my mother asked explicit questions about how to ensure this new will would supersede any previous version, and about what would happen if someone tried to interfere with its filing. The lawyer's replies were professional, reassuring, explaining the process of formally filing the will with the county and ensuring Mr. Pierce, the family's longtime attorney, was properly notified of the update. That was the piece that confused me most. If this will had been properly executed and the original family lawyer notified, why had Mr. Pierce read an older version in his office that day? I decided the only way to find out was to ask him directly. I called his office and requested a private meeting, without David or Denise present. I told his assistant it was about a discrepancy I'd found in my mother's personal papers. Mr. Pierce agreed to see me the following week, and I spent that week gathering everything, organizing the documents into a folder, making copies of everything at the library so I would never be caught without a backup. When I sat down across from him again, in the same office with the same striped light on the carpet, I laid the folder on his desk and asked him, as calmly as I could manage, whether he had ever received correspondence from my mother or from a second attorney regarding an updated will. Mr. Pierce's face changed in a way I will never forget. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was something closer to dawning dread, the expression of a careful man realizing that a mistake he'd made, or a trust he'd extended, had consequences he hadn't foreseen. He asked to see the documents. He read the letter first, then the will, then the email exchange, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, his throat clearing more than once. When he finally looked up, he told me something I hadn't expected. He said that roughly a year and a half earlier, he had received a phone call, not a letter, from David informing him that their mother had been confused lately and had been approached by some lawyer trying to get her to change her will, and that David had asked Mr. Pierce, as the family's trusted longtime attorney, to disregard any updated documents that might surface since their mother wasn't in a state to be making those kinds of decisions. Mr. Pierce told me he had taken David at his word. He had known our family for decades. He had no reason at the time to suspect he was being manipulated rather than informed. He said quietly that he owed me an apology, and more importantly, he owed it to my mother. I want to pause here and tell you something about this moment, because I think it's the heart of the whole story. I did not scream. I did not cry, not there in his office. I felt something colder and steadier than anger. Something that felt almost like clarity finally settling into place after 11 years of not quite understanding why things had always felt slightly unfair, slightly unseen. I asked Mr. Pierce what our options were. He explained that because the second will had been properly executed, notarized, and witnessed, and because we now had documentation of its existence along with evidence that its filing had been actively suppressed based on false information, we had strong legal grounds to challenge the will that had been read in his office and have the second, later will recognized as valid. He recommended I retain independent counsel, since his prior involvement, however unintentional, created a conflict. I didn't rush to court. I want to be clear about that because this isn't a story about lawsuits and shouting matches. What I decided to do instead, after talking it through with Mark for several long nights, was something quieter. I decided to give David and Denise a chance to make this right without a courtroom because whatever they had done, they were still my siblings, and because I still believed, perhaps foolishly, that some part of this could be resolved with truth instead of warfare. I arranged a meeting at my mother's house, the house that was, according to the real will, legally mine. I invited David and Denise, told them only that I had found some of Mom's old papers that I thought we should go through together. I didn't mention the lockbox. I didn't mention the will. I wanted to see, honestly, how they would react to being in that space again, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had mostly stayed away from. Denise arrived first, looking tired, mentioning almost immediately that her marriage had officially ended the month before, that she was struggling financially, that the inheritance, whatever it turned out to be, would matter more to her now than she'd expected. I felt for her. I want you to know that. Whatever came next, I never stopped feeling for her. David arrived 20 minutes later, in the same expensive-looking coat, checking his phone twice before he even sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where our mother had once sat across from me with a legal pad and a pen. I laid the folder on the table between us. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I simply began reading in a calm, even tone, starting with the letter our mother had written, the one addressed to me, the one that described watching me give up my job, my time, my life without complaint, and her fear that someone would try to undo what she'd decided. Denise started crying almost immediately, her hand pressed over her mouth. David sat very still, his face unreadable in the way I imagine it must be during difficult negotiations at his office, but I noticed his hands, folded on the table, had gone tense, the knuckles pale. I read the will next. Then the emails between our mother and the second attorney. And finally, I told them in the same even tone, what Mr. Pierce had told me about the phone call David had made a year and a half earlier, the one describing our mother as confused, the one asking him to disregard any updated documents. The silence after I finished was longer than any silence I had ever sat through in my life. Denise spoke first, her voice thick. She said she hadn't known. She said she'd assumed, the way I think many of us do when it's convenient, that whatever the will said must reflect what our mother wanted, because why would anyone question it? She looked at David, and something in her expression shifted from grief to something sharper, something closer to suspicion of her own. David, to his credit, or perhaps simply because there was nowhere left to hide, didn't deny it outright. He said quietly that he had been worried about the house, about what it meant for his own family's finances, about a business loan he hadn't told either of us about that he'd been counting on his share of the inheritance to help repay. He said he'd told himself at the time that he wasn't stealing anything, just protecting the estate from being changed under confusing circumstances. He said our mother had seemed different in her final years, and that some part of him had genuinely believed or wanted to believe that she wasn't fully herself when she made that decision. I didn't yell at him. I want you to understand why. Not because I wasn't angry, because I was in a way that took weeks to fully unclench from my chest. But because I had spent 11 years learning that the loudest reactions rarely change anything, and that the truth, laid out plainly and calmly, has its own kind of force that doesn't need to be shouted to be felt. I told David that Carol Jenkins, our mother's hospice nurse, remembered that day clearly, remembered our mother as focused and lucid, remembered her saying, "Now it's done right." I told him that a notary doesn't witness a signature from someone who appears incapable of understanding what they're signing, and that if he wanted to argue our mother's competency, he would be arguing against a licensed professional's documented assessment, not against his own convenient memory of a woman he had, by his own admission, visited rarely in her final years. I didn't need to say anything else. I watched something in his posture finally give way, not dramatically, not with tears, just a kind of deflation, the look of a man realizing that the version of events he had built for himself, the one that let him sleep at night, had just been quietly dismantled by a folder of paper on his mother's kitchen table. There was a moment, near the end of that conversation at the kitchen table, when Denise asked to see the letter again, our mother's handwriting slanting across the page in that particular looping style neither of us had seen in years. She read it slowly, her lips moving slightly the way they used to when she was a child, sounding out difficult words, and when she finished, she set it down very carefully, as though it might tear, and said she remembered our mother's handwriting looking exactly like that on birthday cards when we were young, the same slight flourish on the capital letters. It was such a small, strange thing to focus on in that moment, but I understood why she needed it. She needed proof that wasn't just legal, proof that was also emotional, some tether back to the woman our mother had actually been, not the confused, manipulable figure David's version of events had required her to become. David asked at one point whether I intended to go to the police, whether I saw what he'd done as a crime rather than simply a bad decision made under financial pressure. I told him honestly that I hadn't decided, that some part of what he'd done, misrepresenting our mother's condition to Mr. Pierce, actively working to suppress a legally executed document, certainly could be treated as more than a family disagreement if I chose to pursue it that way. I watched real fear cross his face for the first time since he'd sat down at that table, and I let it sit there for a moment before I told him that wasn't the road I wanted to go down, not because he deserved my mercy, but because I didn't want to spend the next several years of my life inside a courtroom instead of inside the life I'd finally been given room to live. I told him the price of my silence on that front was full, immediate cooperation, no delays, no lawyers of his own dragging out the process, no more phone calls to Mr. Pierce or anyone else. He agreed before I even finished the sentence. We didn't resolve everything that day. Grief and guilt and money don't untangle themselves in a single afternoon, and I wouldn't trust a story that claimed otherwise. But something important did happen. David agreed, without needing to be dragged through a courtroom, to formally support the second will's validity, to withdraw any claim on the estate beyond what our mother had specifically allocated to him in that final true document. Denise, for her part, asked if we could really talk about what these past 11 years had actually looked like for me, because she said quietly that she hadn't let herself think about it too closely before and she was ashamed of that now. The legal process still took several months to formalize, filing the will with the county, working with the independent attorney I'd retained, making sure everything was airtight so that no future doubt could ever be cast on what our mother had actually wanted. Mr. Pierce cooperated fully, submitted a signed statement about the phone call from David, and told me privately, near the end of it all, that he had learned something from this that he intended to change in how he handled every family estate from that point forward. He said trust is important, but verification protects the people trust can't always see. I moved into my mother's house eventually, the house I had spent 11 years inside as a caretaker rather than an owner. I remember the first night I slept there as its rightful owner, not as her daughter waiting for the sound of her cane against the hallway floor, not as the person on call for a fall or a fever or a bad night. I lay in the guest room, the one I'd always used, because I couldn't yet bring myself to sleep in her old room, and I cried for a long time, not out of anger, but out of something closer to release. 11 years of holding myself together, finally allowed to come undone in private, in a house that was for the first time entirely mine. Lily, my daughter, was 13 by then, and she asked me once, not long after we'd started slowly moving some of our things into the house, whether I was happy that we'd won. I told her it wasn't really about winning. I told her that what mattered most to me wasn't the house or the money, though I won't pretend those things didn't matter too, especially after everything we'd sacrificed. What mattered most was that my mother's actual voice, her actual wishes, the truth of what she had seen in me during all those years of care, had finally been allowed to speak. That someone had tried to silence her, and in the end she had left behind enough of herself, in a locked box on a closet shelf, to make sure she couldn't be. Denise and I are closer now than we've ever been. She calls more often, not out of guilt I don't think, but because something in her did genuinely wake up that day at the kitchen table. David and I are civil, though the closeness we might have had as siblings never quite recovered, and I've made peace with that in the slow way you make peace with things that can't be undone but also don't need to keep bleeding. He repaid quietly, over the following year, a portion of what he had tried to claim, though I never asked him to. I think, in his own way, it was the only apology he knew how to make. I still have the lockbox. It sits on a shelf in what is now my home office, empty now, the documents long since transferred into a proper safe deposit box of my own, this time with the key in a place my own daughter knows about. I kept it because I think sometimes we need physical reminders of the moments that taught us something essential, and what that lockbox taught me was this: love that is real doesn't need to be loud to leave a mark. My mother wasn't a woman who raised her voice or made grand declarations. She showed her love in a legal pad and a pen at a kitchen table, in a lockbox on a closet shelf, in a hospice nurse's memory of 5 careful words. Now it's done right. And in the end it was. I think about her most on quiet mornings now, when I make coffee in the kitchen that used to be hers, in the particular gold light that comes through those same blinds around 7 in the morning. I don't feel bitterness anymore when I think about those 11 years, not really. I feel something closer to gratitude, strange as that might sound, because those years, as hard as they were, gave me something no inheritance ever could have. The certainty, etched into every memory I have of her, that I knew her completely in a way my siblings, for all their good intentions and busy lives, simply never had the chance to. She knew that too. She made sure I would always know she knew it. And that, more than the house, more than the money, more than the quiet vindication of watching the truth finally come to light in a room full of people who had doubted it, is the thing I carry with me now. Some inheritances are written in ink. Others are written in the years themselves, in the mornings and the medications and the hands you hold when no one else will. My mother left me both in the end. It just took a little while and a locked box on a closet shelf for the second one to be believed.